The missile warning blared in Captain Addison Murphy's cockpit. 10 Chinese J-20 stealth fighters were closing in on her unarmed Sortie cargo plane. She had maybe 3 minutes left to live. Echo Base, this is Cargo 72. I'm being attacked. Multiple enemy fighters heading my way. Nothing but static came back. They'd blocked her radio. A burst of cannon fire ripped through her left engine. The heavy transport shook violently, smoke pouring out. 3 engines remained, 10 fighters moving in for the final blow. Her loadmaster, Rodriguez, started praying in the back. The enemy pilots were probably grinning. One big, slow, defenseless cargo plane against 10 of the world's most advanced fighters. Then something changed inside Addison's mind. 15 years of buried training came rushing back. Skills she hadn't touched since leaving fighters 8 years ago. Instincts coded into her very being. Everything returned in an instant. She stopped thinking like a transport pilot just trying to stay alive. She started thinking like what she once was. Rodriguez, she called out. Her voice completely transformed. Cold, steady, dangerous. Strap yourself in tight. Things are about to get rough. The Sortie Hercules, 170,000 pounds of cargo aircraft never meant for battle, suddenly flipped 90 degrees and plunged like a fighter jet. The first Chinese pilot's smug expression vanished as his helpless target pulled off a barrel roll that defied the laws of physics. Drop a comment and subscribe because what unfolded in the next 23 minutes would change aviation history and expose the truth that Captain Addison Murphy had been concealing. She used to be one of the most lethal fighter pilots in the U.S. Air Force, until the day she walked away and became a cargo pilot that everyone assumed was just a truck driver with wings. They had no idea how wrong they were. Captain Addison Murphy was 28 years old, currently flying with the 37th Airlift Squadron, operating Sortie J Hercules cargo aircraft in the Pacific Theater. She stood 5'7", kept herself in shape through dedicated gym routines, had auburn hair usually tied back in a regulation bun, and green eyes that most people mistook for tired, but were actually constantly watching and analyzing in ways her fellow transport pilots never picked up on. Originally from Colorado, she was the daughter of an Air Force mechanic who taught her that every aircraft was simply a machine obeying the laws of physics. You just needed to know which laws applied when. What her current squadron didn't realize, what wasn't recorded in any of her files for the past 6 years, was that before becoming a transport pilot, Addison had spent 4 years flying F-22 Raptors with the 1st Fighter Wing. Not just flying them. She was among the absolute best pilots in the program. She'd logged over 600 hours in the Raptor, trained in every air combat scenario the Air Force could create, and was selected for a classified program teaching advanced air combat tactics to Allied forces. Then her younger brother, a Marine, died in combat. Something inside Addison shattered. Not her abilities, not her talent, but her willingness to be at the sharp end of the spear, to be the one pulling triggers, to be responsible for ending lives, even enemy lives. She requested a transfer out of fighters and into transport at 22 years old, accepting a career setback that made her commanders think she'd lost her nerve, enduring the quiet rumors that she'd failed in the fighter community. For 6 years she flew cargo planes, hauling medical supplies, troops, equipment. Predictable, safe, boring. She convinced herself she was finished with that other life, that other pilot who thrived on the 3-dimensional chess game of air combat. Then 10 enemy fighters tried to kill her, and that other pilot came back to life. The Sortie was never built for air combat. It was built to carry cargo, to be stable and reliable, to absorb damage and keep flying. It carried 0 weapons, minimal defensive systems, and handled like a flying brick compared to a fighter jet. But Addison had spent 4 years mastering the physics of air combat, understanding energy management angles, and the tactical geometry that separated exceptional fighter pilots from average ones. She understood something most people miss. Any aircraft, no matter how clumsy, could be pushed past its design limits if you knew those limits and accepted the risks. The first J-20 moved in for a gun kill, certain the lumbering transport was finished. The Chinese pilot expected the Hercules to keep flying straight, maybe attempt some weak evasive moves, but ultimately just go down. Instead, the moment the J-20 committed to his attack, Addison rolled the Sortie 90 degrees, making Rodriguez scream in terror and yanked back on the controls, pulling off a maneuver that should have been impossible for a cargo aircraft. The massive Hercules entered a climbing barrel roll, trading airspeed for height, and the J-20's cannon rounds missed completely, passing through empty air where the transport should have been. More importantly, the J-20 pilot, approaching at 450 knots toward what he thought was a sitting duck, suddenly found himself overshooting a target that had changed direction dramatically. He flashed past the Sortie's left wing with barely 100 feet to spare. That's when Addison executed her second impossible maneuver. She snapped back level and dove, building speed, positioning the massive transport so that when the J-20 pilot tried to circle around for another attempt, he'd have to maneuver around her. In 30 seconds of that first engagement, Addison hadn't fired a single shot. She couldn't. She had no weapons. But she'd forced an enemy fighter to abort his attack and completely reposition. More importantly, she'd shown the other 9 enemy pilots that their helpless target wasn't helpless at all. Echo base. Any station. This is Cargo 72, she transmitted openly, knowing the enemy was listening. I'm being attacked by 10 enemy fighters. I'm evading and maneuvering. Requesting any available air support. The answer came from somewhere unexpected. Cargo 72, this is Viper flight. We're 2 F-35s 90 miles southwest of your position. Can you hold out for 8 minutes? 8 minutes against 10 enemy fighters in an unarmed cargo plane. Viper flight, I'll do everything I can. Be advised I'm in a Sortie Hercules with battle damage and 3 engines. Cargo only, no combat systems. A pause then. Cargo 72, did you just say you're maneuvering against fighters in a Hercules? That's correct, Viper, and I'd really appreciate that support sooner than later. What Viper flight didn't realize, what nobody could have imagined, was that Addison wasn't just maneuvering defensively. She was running a tactical plan based on 10 years of air combat training and a deep understanding of how fighter pilots think. The J-20s had every advantage: more planes, faster speed, better weapons, every tactical edge except one. They were thinking like fighter pilots attacking a cargo plane. Addison was thinking like a fighter pilot who just happened to be flying a cargo plane. She knew their next move. The Chinese flight lead would divide his forces, probably splitting into 2 groups. First group would keep up aggressive attacks trying to destroy the damaged transport quickly. Second group would climb high to cover their teammates and block any help from arriving. That's exactly what they did. 4 J-20s formed up for coordinated attacks. 6 more climbed to 30,000 feet to set up overwatch. Addison did something totally unexpected. She flew directly at the attacking group. "Ma'am, they're right ahead of us," Rodriguez yelled from the back. "I know, hang on." The 4 J-20s split into 2 pairs, setting up a classic bracket attack. 2 from the left, 2 from the right, timing their runs so Addison couldn't dodge both directions at once. But she'd seen this setup countless times in training. She knew the timing, knew the geometry, knew precisely when each pilot would commit to his attack. At the critical moment when all 4 enemy fighters had committed and couldn't abort without looking foolish, Addison did something completely crazy. She shut down her number 3 engine. The massive Hercules immediately started yawing right as uneven thrust tried to spin the aircraft. But Addison was already adjusting, using her rudder and power from the remaining engines to control the spin while simultaneously diving and rolling left. The maneuver was so bizarre, so unexpected, that all 4 J-20 pilots missed their shot. More importantly, 2 of them nearly crashed into each other as their attack runs converged on where the Sortie should have been. Chinese doctrine stressed disciplined formation, flying, Nearly hitting your wingman was embarrassing. The two pilots broke away, creating temporary chaos in their attack pattern. Addison seized that chaos. She restarted engine 3, leveled her wings, and suddenly reversed course, heading straight toward Echo Base at maximum speed her damaged aircraft could manage. She'd just bought herself another minute, maybe 90 seconds. Viper flight, cargo 72. How far out are you? 6 minutes. Cargo, we're pushing as hard as we can. Can you really hold them off? Not sure, Viper, but I'm about to try something foolish and hope it works. Define foolish. Have you ever seen a cargo aircraft do a split S? Negative. That's because it's impossible. Well, you're about to witness one, or watch me die trying. The 6 J-20s on high perch had been observing with growing confusion. Their intelligence brief said American transport pilots were just truck drivers with wings, competent at straight flying but helpless in combat. This pilot was doing things with a Sortie that violated everything they knew about transport aircraft. Barrel rolls, high G turns, aggressive maneuvering that should have ripped the wings clean off. Their flight lead made his decision. All 10 fighters would coordinate one massive attack. No way the transport could dodge 10 simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Addison saw them forming up on her displays. She knew what was coming. 10 fighters, coordinated attack, overlapping firing solutions. In about 90 seconds, they'd all launch together and shred her aircraft to pieces. She had one card left to play. It was so insane it might actually work. Rodriguez, I need you to do something. Ma'am, with respect, I'd like to request we just land and surrender, because whatever you're planning sounds worse than being captured. Can't land. We're over water. Listen carefully. Go back to the cargo bay and find the emergency equipment pallet. There should be flare dispensers for ground operations. I need you to set them up to deploy out the ramp. Ma'am, those are ground flares for... I know what they're for. Can you do it? Yes, ma'am. But do it quickly and get ready to lower the ramp on my command. While Rodriguez scrambled to set up the improvised defensive system, Addison studied her tactical display. The enemy fighters were almost in position. She had maybe 60 seconds. She selected a waypoint on her navigation display, a specific point in 3-dimensional space, and locked it in. Then she did something that could have gotten her court-martialed under normal circumstances. She shut down engines 2 and 3, leaving only the 2 outer engines running. The Sortie immediately became nearly impossible to control, yawing and rolling, as uneven thrust and the damaged left engine fought each other. Rodriguez, are you ready? Rigged and ready, ma'am. But I have to say, this is the worst day of my career. If this works, it'll be a story you tell for the rest of your life. If it doesn't work, well, neither of us will be around to care. Lower the ramp. The rear cargo ramp dropped, dramatically increasing drag and making the already barely controllable Hercules even worse. Addison wrestled the controls, keeping the aircraft flying through pure determination and deep knowledge of flight dynamics. The 10 J-20s began their attack runs. Addison hit the waypoint she'd programmed and executed the most insane maneuver of her career. The C-30 Hercules, flying on 2 engines with its ramp down and battle damage smoking from one wing, rolled upside down and pulled through a split S maneuver that should have been aerodynamically impossible. Flares now. Rodriguez triggered the improvised system. Dozens of ground flares designed to light up battlefields deployed out the lowered ramp as the inverted C-30 dove through its turn. The flares tumbled through the air behind the aircraft, creating a massive cloud of burning white-hot heat signatures. The 10 J-20s, all of which had locked their heat-seeking missiles on the Hercules engines, suddenly watched their targeting systems go haywire as dozens of heat sources appeared. Automated fire-and-forget missiles designed to chase the hottest target broke lock and started chasing flares instead of the actual aircraft. Addison completed the split S, rolled upright, restarted engines 2 and 3, and leveled out barely 1,000 feet above the ocean, flying so low that enemy radar struggled to maintain lock through the sea clutter. Rodriguez, ramp up. Already on it, ma'am. The 10 Chinese pilots were professional enough to recover from the surprise quickly. Half had wasted missiles on flares. The other half had held fire and were reforming for gun attacks. But now they faced a problem. The Sortie was at wave top level, which meant any attack run had to be precisely calculated or they'd fly into the ocean, and they'd just wasted 2 minutes while their target covered another 15 miles. Addison checked her clock, 4 minutes until the F-35s arrived. She might actually survive this. The J-20 flight lead no longer saw this as an easy kill of a helpless transport. He saw it as a personal challenge. One cargo plane, damaged, had evaded his entire squadron for 7 minutes. That was unacceptable. He organized his remaining fighters into a well-planned trap. 4 would make gun runs from different angles. The other 6 would establish a barrier patrol between the Sortie and Echo base, making sure the transport couldn't escape. It was textbook tactics. Professionally done, the right move against a transport trying to run. But Addison wasn't running. She was buying time. And she'd just noticed something interesting on her threat display. The 4 fighters coming in for gun attacks had spread out to attack from different directions. Smart tactical choice to prevent the transport from evading all of them at once. But it meant each fighter was temporarily alone without backup from wingmen. Addison had spent 4 years training in fighter combat where the fundamental rule was never fight alone. She waited until the first J-20 committed to his attack run. Long straight line, closing fast, guns armed, totally focused on killing the transport. Then she did something no transport pilot should ever do. She turned into the attack. The massive Sortie snapped into a roll and turned straight at the approaching fighter, creating head-on geometry that made the Chinese pilot's eyes go wide with shock. Sorties don't do that. They don't turn into attacks. They don't play chicken with fighters. The J-20 pilot had to make a split-second choice, break off or take the shot, knowing he'd have to maneuver violently to avoid collision. He chose wrong. He took the shot. His cannon rounds passed just above the Sortie's cockpit, close enough that Rodriguez screamed and Addison heard impacts on her fuselage, but critically the J-20 pilot was now committed to a collision course with a 170,000-pound aircraft that wasn't going to flinch. At the last possible second, the J-20 broke hard left, pulling enough G-forces to probably gray out his vision. That's when he flew directly into the path of his wingman, who'd been setting up his own attack and hadn't expected his lead to maneuver so aggressively. The 2 J-20s didn't quite collide. Both pilots were skilled enough to avoid that, but they came close enough that both had to abandon their attacks and focus on not dying. Fighter number 3 saw what happened and wisely aborted his run. Fighter number 4 was too committed to abort and pressed his attack, but Addison had already rolled back level and dropped to 50 feet above the ocean, so low that the J-20 pilot broke off rather than risk flying into the water while focused on his target. 8 minutes. 4 enemy fighters effectively neutralized through aggressive maneuvering and psychological warfare. 0 shots fired by the Sortie because it had no weapons. Viper flight, Cargo 72, please tell me you're close. Cargo 72, Viper flight is 2 minutes out. Paint us a picture. What's your situation? Viper, I've got 6 enemy fighters forming barrier patrol at my 12 o'clock, 8,000 feet. Probably waiting to intercept me if I try to run. 4 more fighters are trying to reorganize for gun runs. I'm at 50 feet above the water, 3 engines, flying on fumes and willpower. Cargo, how on earth are you still alive? Long story, Viper. Recommend you come in fast and hot. These guys are getting frustrated, and frustrated pilots make mistakes. The 2 F-35 Lightning II fighters came screaming in at Mach 1, their advanced radars lighting up the tactical picture. Major Sarah Blackwood, Viper lead, had flown combat missions all over the world, but she'd never seen anything like what her radar was showing. 1 damaged Sortie at wave top level, 10 enemy stealth fighters in aggressive formation, and according to the data link from an AWACS aircraft monitoring the situation, the transport had been evading and maneuvering for almost 9 minutes. Viper 2, you seeing this? Affirmative, lead. That Sortie pilot must be insane or incredibly skilled. Viper flight, weapons free. Let's take these fighters off our cargo pilot before they get lucky. The F-35s were 5th-generation stealth fighters with sensor fusion that made them devastatingly effective in combat. The J-20s were also 5th-generation stealth fighters. What followed was a brief but incredibly violent air battle. The 6 J-20s on barrier patrol never saw the F-35s coming until missiles were already in flight. 2 J-20s died in the first 15 seconds. The remaining 4 scattered, turning the organized barrier into chaos. Viper flight pressed the attack. Another J-20 went down to a missile shot. The others were running, their mission now survival instead of killing the transport. But the 4 J-20s who'd been attacking the Sortie made a different calculation. They had numerical superiority over the 2 F-35s, 4 versus 2. If they could down the American fighters quickly, they could still complete their mission and kill the transport. They turned to engage. Major Blackwood found herself in a knife fight with 4 enemy fighters, outnumbered 2-1, trying to protect a cargo aircraft that was still flying at wave-top level because its pilot probably didn't trust the battle above not to spill down to her altitude. Cargo 72, Viper lead, you need to climb and get clear of the engagement area. Negative Viper lead. I'm staying low where the J-20s can't bounce me without warning. You focus on your fight. I'll stay out of your way. Blackwood would have argued, but she was suddenly defensive as 2 J-20s engaged her while the other 2 went after Viper 2. The fight spiraled across 50 miles of sky. Missiles fired, fighters maneuvering at the edge of human tolerance. Viper 2 splashed 1 J-20 with a gun kill. Blackwood nailed another with her last missile. That left 2 J-20s, and both F-35s were out of missiles, down to guns only. The 2 remaining J-20s had the same problem. They'd spent all their missiles on the transport or on the F. Now it would come down to classic dogfighting, except there was a third element nobody had considered. Down at wave-top level, Captain Addison Murphy had been watching the air battle and made a calculation. The fight was moving in a specific direction. The geometry was developing in a predictable pattern, and there was a way she could help. She pushed her throttles to maximum power, climbed to 2,000 feet, and positioned her battered Sortie in a very specific location. Major Blackwood was defensive, a J-20 on her tail, trying to get her nose around for a shot and not quite making it. The Chinese pilot was good, trained, disciplined, patient. She needed help. Viper 2, I've got one on my 6. I'm defensive. Viper lead, I'm engaged with the other one. Can't break off. This was bad. The J-20 on her tail was timing his shot, waiting for her to make a mistake or run out of energy. In 30 seconds he'd have a kill. Then her radio crackled. Viper lead, cargo 72. I'm at your 2 o'clock low, 2,000 feet. If you can drag that J-20 past my position, I can help. Blackwood's first instinct was to refuse. What could a cargo plane do? But she was out of options. Cargo, how can you possibly help? Trust me, Major, just fly past my left side, about 500 feet lateral separation. Blackwood made the decision. She dove toward the Sortie's position, the J-20 following her, probably thinking she was trying to escape to low altitude. As she approached the Sortie, she saw why the transport pilot had positioned herself where she had. The Sortie was flying perpendicular to Blackwood's direction of travel. In 5 seconds, Blackwood would flash past the Sortie's left side, and the J-20 pursuing her would pass even closer to the transport. At the exact moment the J-20 was focused entirely on getting a firing solution on Viper lead, Addison did something that violated every rule of air safety ever written. She turned directly into the J-20's flight path. The J-20 pilot saw the massive Sortie suddenly filling his canopy from an angle he hadn't been watching. His threat warning screamed collision alert. He had exactly 1 second to react. He broke hard right, abandoning his attack on Viper lead to avoid flying into a cargo plane. That maneuver put him in a terrible energy state. Nose high, leading speed, vulnerable. Major Blackwood reversed her turn and took the shot. Her cannon rounds walked across the J-20's fuselage. The fighter's left engine exploded and the Chinese pilot ejected. Splash 1, Blackwood called. Cargo 72. I don't know what you just did, but thank you. Just flying, Major. How's Viper 2? Viper 2 had used the distraction to maneuver into position on his J-20's tail. He fired. The last enemy fighter went down. Viper flight, all bandits splashed. Area clear. For the first time in 12 minutes, Addison allowed herself to breathe. Viper lead, cargo 72. Thanks for the assist. I'm heading to Echo Base. 3 engines, multiple systems damaged, running on fumes. Request you escort me in. Roger, cargo. And when we land, you owe me an explanation for how a transport pilot managed to evade 10 fighters for that long. It's a long story, Major. The Sortie limped into Echo Base 30 minutes later, its left wing scorched from battle damage, hydraulic fluid leaking, number 1 engine completely destroyed, and the entire fuselage riddled with bullet holes. It was a miracle the aircraft was still flying. As Addison shut down the remaining engines and completed her post-flight checklist, she saw a crowd gathering on the ramp. Word had spread. A cargo pilot had fought off 10 enemy fighters and survived. Major Blackwood was there along with her wingman. So was the base commander, Colonel Marcus Hill, and about 50 other people who'd heard the radio transmissions and couldn't believe what they'd heard. Addison climbed out of the cockpit, exhausted, her flight suit soaked with sweat, and came face to face with Colonel Hill. Captain Murphy, Hill said slowly, I've just reviewed the engagement data from the AWACS aircraft and from Major Blackwood's aircraft. According to that data, you maneuvered a C-40 Hercules through 12 minutes of air combat against 10 enemy fighters, executing maneuvers that shouldn't be possible in that aircraft, and directly contributed to shooting down 2 of them. How? Addison looked at the crowd, at the damaged aircraft behind her, at Major Blackwood, who was staring at her like she was seeing a ghost. Sir, I have a confession to make. I'm not just a transport pilot. She explained all of it. The 4 years in F-22s, the combat training, the classified programs, the transfer to transports after her brother died at 22, 6 years of flying cargo, trying to forget that other life. I thought I was done with air combat, sir. I thought I'd left that pilot behind. But when those fighters came after me, all that training came back. I couldn't help it. I flew the C-40 like I used to fly the F-22, using energy management, tactical geometry, understanding how enemy pilots think. It shouldn't have worked. That aircraft was never designed for combat maneuvering. But I knew if I could survive long enough for help to arrive, I had a chance. Colonel Hill stared at her for a long moment. Then he started laughing. Captain Murphy, do you have any idea what you've just done? You've proven that a cargo aircraft flown by someone with the right training can be a combat platform. You've single-handedly invalidated decades of assumptions about transport vulnerability, and you've probably given every fighter pilot in the world nightmares about what happens when they underestimate their opponent. Major Blackwood stepped forward. Captain, I looked up your file after we landed. You were one of the top Raptor pilots in your class. You had a 92% kill rate in red flag exercises. You were being groomed for the weapons school. Why did you leave fighters? Because I got tired of killing people, Major. Even enemy pilots. After my brother died, I couldn't justify it anymore. I wanted to save lives, not take them. Transport seemed like the answer. And today I didn't kill anyone, Major. I evaded, maneuvered, bought time for you to arrive. The 2 fighters that went down because of my actions, those were your kills, not mine. I just positioned them for you, that I can live with. 3 weeks later, Addison sat in a conference room at Pacific Air Force's headquarters, facing a panel of senior officers who'd spent the past 3 weeks analyzing every second of her engagement with the Chinese fighters. Captain Murphy, the lead officer, said, "We've completed our investigation. Your actions were highly irregular, violated several standard operating procedures, and put your aircraft and crew at extreme risk." Addison's heart sank. Here came the reprimand. However, the officer continued, "Your actions also saved your crew, preserved a valuable aircraft, and directly contributed to the destruction of 8 enemy fighters, the 2 you helped Major Blackwood kill, plus 6 more that were subsequently shot down when they tried to escape, and ran into a flight of F-22s that had been scrambled to your aid. Your tactical decisions were unorthodox, but effective. Your understanding of air combat theory is exceptional, and your ability to apply fighter tactics in a non-fighter aircraft is unprecedented." He paused. "We're offering you 2 options. First option, you can return to transport duty, with commendation for your actions and no further consequences. Second option, you can return to fighters. We've already arranged a slot for you at the weapons school if you want it. Your combat hours in the F-22 are still valid. You could be instructing within 6 months." Addison looked at the panel. Return to fighters. Return to that life. The life she'd left because she couldn't handle taking lives anymore. "Sir, with respect, I have a third option. Keep me in transports but let me develop a training program. Teach transport pilots basic fighter maneuvers, energy management, threat evasion. Not to turn them into combat pilots, but to give them a chance to survive if they end up in a situation like mine. Most transport pilots have never even thought about air combat tactics. I can change that. The officers looked at each other. Finally, the lead officer smiled. Captain Murphy, that's an outstanding idea. You're authorized to develop a training curriculum for transport pilot combat survival. You'll have access to fighter aircraft for demonstrations, and we'll assign you instructors from the weapons school to assist. This could save lives. Addison felt something relax in her chest that had been tense for 6 years. Thank you, sir. I'll make it work. 6 months later, the first class of 20 transport pilots gathered at Nellis Air Force Base for the newly created Transport Combat Survival course. They'd all volunteered, all heard the story of the C-130 pilot who'd fought off 10 fighters, all wanted to learn. Addison stood in front of them, beside her on a screen, showing gun camera footage from that day, over the South China Sea. You're all here because you fly cargo aircraft, tankers, transports, aircraft that have zero air-to-air capability and were never designed for combat. But I'm here to tell you that never designed for combat doesn't mean can't survive combat. It just means you need to think differently. She clicked through to tactical diagrams. Fighter combat is about energy management, angles, and understanding how your opponent thinks. Those principles don't change just because you're flying a cargo plane instead of a fighter. You can't outturn an enemy fighter. You can't outrun one. You certainly can't outgun one, but you can outthink one if you understand the fundamental. She spent the next 2 weeks teaching them everything she knew. Energy management, how to use gravity, airspeed, and altitude to your advantage, even in a slow aircraft. Tactical geometry, understanding angles of attack and how to position yourself to make the enemy pilot's job difficult. Psychological warfare, using unexpected maneuvers to create confusion and hesitation. And most importantly, survival mindset, the understanding that your job isn't to win a fight, it's to survive long enough for help to arrive. At the end of the course, she took each pilot up in a C-130 and had an F-16 from the aggressor squadron simulate attack runs. The improvement was dramatic. Pilots who'd started the course with no idea how to evade a fighter were now executing barrel rolls, defensive splits, and energy management tactics that gave even experienced fighter pilots trouble. The program became mandatory for all transport pilots in combat zone. The training manual she wrote became required reading, and the story of the cargo pilot who'd fought 10 fighters became legend. Years later, long after Addison had retired from active duty and was teaching aviation theory at the Air Force Academy, a student asked her the question everyone always asked. "Ma'am, when those fighters came after you, were you scared?" Addison thought about that day, the screaming alarms, the damaged engine, the knowledge that she was probably going to die, and then the moment when that other pilot, the fighter pilot she'd thought was gone forever, had woken up inside her. "Yes," she said honestly, "I was terrified, but I was also alive, more alive than I'd been in 6 years, because for all those years, I'd been trying to be someone I wasn't. I'd convinced myself I was just a transport pilot, that I'd left that fighter pilot behind. But that day proved something important. You can't run from who you really are. You can change your job, change your role, try to be someone different, but when the crisis comes, when everything's on the line, you become who you've always been. So you're a fighter pilot." "No, Addison's. I'm a pilot who understands combat, but I'm also someone who chose to use that understanding to save lives, instead of take them. That day over the South China Sea, I didn't kill anyone. I survived. I helped others survive. And when the real fighters arrived, I positioned the enemy so they could do their job. That's what I was meant to do all along, not be the sword, but be the shield that gives the sword time to arrive." The student nodded slowly. "So the lesson is, don't let people underestimate you." "The lesson," Addison said, "is that who you used to be never really goes away. It's always there, waiting, and sometimes the skills you think you've left behind are exactly the skills you need to survive." I spent 6 years as a transport pilot, trying to forget I'd ever been a fighter pilot. Then one day, I needed to be both at the same time, a transport pilot, with a fighter pilot's brain. That combination saved my life, and my crew. She pulled up the footage one more time, that impossible barrel roll in a C-130, the split S maneuver that should have torn the wings off.
The head-on pass that made a stealth fighter blink. They thought I was just a transport pilot, and I'd spent 6 years believing that myself. But I was never just anything. None of us are. We're all the sum of everything we've learned, everything we've been, every version of ourselves we've ever tried to be. That day, I was a transport pilot, and a fighter pilot, and a survivor, and someone who refused to die without a fight. All of it, at once. All of it mattering. And that's what saved you. That's what saved all of us. Because the enemy pilots saw a helpless cargo plane, but what they actually faced was a fighter pilot who happened to be flying a cargo plane, and that made all the difference. The engagement over the South China Sea remained classified for 5 years. When it was finally declassified, aviation historians studied it as a unique example of asymmetric air combat, one aircraft, with 0 weapons defeating multiple enemy fighters through superior tactics and psychological warfare. The Chinese pilots who survived the engagement, 6 of the 10 had ejected safely, later said in interviews that they'd been confused and demoralized by the cargo aircraft that wouldn't die, that seemed to anticipate their every move, that flew in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One Chinese pilot said, "We were told it was a simple mission, one transport, no escorts, easy kill. Instead, we faced a pilot who understood air combat better than most fighter pilots I've flown against, flying a cargo plane like it was a fighter jet. It was disturbing, like fighting a ghost." That quote became famous, the ghost in the cargo plane. It was exactly the kind of story that military aviators loved, the underdog, the unexpected, the moment when someone revealed they were so much more than anyone had known. But for Addison, the real victory wasn't surviving the engagement or becoming famous. The real victory was understanding that you could be more than one thing. You could be a transport pilot who'd once been a fighter pilot. You could choose to save lives instead of taking them, but still use combat skills when survival demanded it. You could be whoever you needed to be, whenever you needed to be it, and nobody could put you in a box and tell you what you were capable of, because they thought she was just a transport pilot, and she'd spent 6 years thinking the same thing, until the day she needed to be more, and then she was. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales of courage.